Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you. We have one more panel discussion on a topic near and dear to the hearts of many, or near, dear, and a source of fear, I would say. Data, how to deal with it, how to share it, how to access it, what to do with it. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Mary to kick this one off. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Bogle with the Urban Institute. I work with Sue Popkin in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center on the Housing Opportunities and Services Together network. So I'm here to moderate the panel today on making data sharing agreements work. And I'm very interested in this topic myself because I've encountered some of this kind of work with the Boston Promise neighborhood and another stream of work I do. So we have a great panel today. I'll be asking questions of the panel at the end, but I want to introduce you to, and I'll let them each provide more details. But to my left is Andrew Lofton, Executive Director of the Seattle Housing Authority. And then next to Andrew is James Bush, Director of Family and Community Partnerships for Seattle Public Schools. And then we have Kathleen Stiles, Chief Privacy Officer of the U.S. Department of Education, so I'm sure she'll have a lot to say about the confidentiality and data sharing issues. And then we have Howard Grant, VP of Governmental and External Affairs with the Atlanta Housing Authority. So again, I'm going to ask each panelist as they go, starting with Andrew, to tell you a little bit more about themselves, and then get us into the topic. And I'll be back for the question session as a discussant. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. I'm Andrew Lofton with the Seattle Housing Authority. Seattle Housing Authority has about a total of 18,000 units, housing choice vouchers, as well as public housing units in the city. We've initiated this partnership with the Seattle School District. It's going on about 3 or 4 years now, and are rapidly learning more and more about both the challenges as well as the value that it brings for our residents as well as for the school district. So we just introduce each other now, or are we
Just go ahead. I just introduce yourself and then go ahead with your section. Everybody can introduce themselves in turn. So go ahead.
So I'm going to just start this off with just a couple of slides that kind of show a little bit about what we do, what we've been able to learn, and what has driven us to our focus with the Seattle School District now on some of the data that we're sharing. And many of you who are working on or have worked through data sharing agreements understand the challenges that they present and the difficulty in getting an agreement that is pragmatic and that works and is compliant with all of the requirements. James is here so that when I start speaking, he will make noise so that Kathleen doesn't really hear what we've been doing. But they are challenging, but they're also very, very valuable. And we have a very, I think, a very rich partnership that we've been able to develop with the Seattle Public Schools, and that data sharing agreement is really at the heart of it. And what we really started to do in our partnership was really try to focus on how would we as two institutions look toward really our systems and how we would change our systems so that ultimately the work that we do is going to be sustainable, that we will introduce some things that will carry over beyond administrations, beyond actual programs, that will continue to be valuable and continue to benefit our residents and the school district in years and years to come. So we've been trying to look at, well, what are those, how do we do that? And what are those things that we have to have in place overall that will allow us to reap the benefits of that for many years to come?
I think it's
So it's
this one here.
okay. So Our effort began with, let's try to understand who we are serving and what is the connections between the housing authority and the school district. And we have found out that 1 in 10 of the Sale School District's population are residents of our housing. And in fact, that has actually gone down over the last 5 years. And when we first started this work, we were about 1 in 7 or 1 in 6 of the population of the Sale Public Schools. And as the school district's population has grown, our population has been basically stable, but it declined a little bit. So, but there's still a significant number of folks that that are in our housing that attend public schools. This map kind of just demonstrates, it's a map of the geographic area of Seattle, and it just demonstrates, those dots are where our schools in which we have students in them. And it just reflects that we are all over the city, that it's not a one concentration of students. It's a reflection of the city, and it's a reflection that our residents are all over the city, and the schools that they go to are located all over the city. So coming up with a strategy to address issues that our residents have in schools couldn't be just a place-based strategy. It had to be something that reflected what is reflection of where our students live, where our students go to school. And so it is it was necessary to understand that this was not going to be just a focus on this one area, but we had to figure out, well, then how do we deal with issues that affect all students, therefore all schools? We have been trying to align with the school district common goals. What are some things that we have in common from both of our missions? And one of those things actually is academic achievement. You know, we are both in the business of wanting our clients, our residents, to achieve academically, to do better academically. That's obviously the school district's basic core mission. For us, it's an important component of helping our residents be successful. Education is a pathway, has always been a pathway for individuals to get out of poverty, for individuals to have individual success, family success. And the more success that you have individually, the better performance that the Housing Authority has as well. So we began with, okay, how do we achieve that common objective? What are the things that we can do together to make that work? The thing that we kind of got focused on was absenteeism, because if you're not in school, if you're not there, you don't learn. And not only is that a common sense kind of a recognition and acknowledgement, but there's also lots of research that backs that up in terms of the number of days or the amount of time that people spend out of school is correlated to how well they do. So we began to look at, well, what's that look like for us? And this is a chart that is pretty stark for us, because it shows that essentially the rate of absenteeism for our residents in all grades is roughly double that of the general population in the Scale School District. Well, that has obviously some very distinct implications in the terms of the education outcomes for those students as well. So that then kind of got us laser focused on what are some things that we can do to address that particular issue. Because if we can improve that particular characteristic, then it should follow that the education outcomes should start improving as well. So what we have done with the data is to map those schools that we showed you earlier. If I can go back. Oh, how about that? Then we can begin to look at strategies that will start to affect that performance of those residents and those students in those particular schools. The other thing that it began to tell us is that we had to also figure out different strategies. And one of those strategies is that we had to also start talking with the principals of these schools. That we couldn't just put in programs and say this is going to solve the problem. But we had to start to look at each individual school, start to talk to their principals and ask them, well, what do you need from us as the housing authority to really affect this? And that process is an ongoing one. As we are meeting with principals, we are having those kind of focus group conversations, and we're starting to get from them, here are the things that we need to recognize that we can do, that we can bring to the table. I will say the one thing that we have to also get past is the very first question from the principals is, well, what can you do for me? Can you give me some assistance? Can you give me some additional dollars to help with this? And so it'll take some time to kind of get past we're not just another source, a fund source. This is a partnership that we need to start strategizing of what it is that you need in your building that we as a housing authority, because we touch these families on a regular basis, what can we provide to you to start to affect this particular issue? So I'll stop with there and we'll have time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So I'm James Bush, and I'm the Director of Family and Community Partnerships, and I've been with the Seattle School District for about, 367 days. So I'm not here, so I didn't get my watch yet. But one thing that I'm thankful for coming into this relationship is having the leadership of Andrew and the team to kind of make sure this work has been going on for multiple years. And I came into my role with a strong team, strong systems, and things that were in place that were therefore making sure that we're making the connections between principals and programs and making sure that there's items in place to make sure that everybody's effective in working at systems and looking at things systematically. One of the things that we've made sure that we worked on as a result of Andrew's leadership and our superintendent, who's really all about partnerships and kind of bringing systems together, was how do we change the way that we operate? We have, on my team, I have a data alignment manager that historically lived in our Department of Technology in a system with 100 people, and how do you get data and how do you get customer service? So one of the first things that the former manager or director of the department did was, we're bringing that person that's going to work with the data upstairs and work with the community partnerships team to make sure that when partners are asking for data, whether it's a small CBO, Seattle Housing Authority, the City of Seattle, they have a partner in the city or with the Seattle District to make sure that we're accessible and can kind of resolve and respond to problems and make sure that we're FERPA compliant. But it's been an awesome place to kind of learn and kind of partner, and so it's been able to give us some opportunities to do some pretty cutting edge work. And when we're talking about, we're wrapping up our Deep Dive 3 Race to the Top project. Because we had data sharing agreements in place to share the non-identifiable proxy data, we had that kind of baseline established. We were able to kind of look at what are those school level interventions we're going to work at, and how are we going to work with our legal teams to make sure that schools and principals are getting data that is actually helping inform the practice in the classrooms, in the schools, to make sure the interventions and supports that we're developing are getting to the kids that we want. And that's because we have data sharing agreements that are kind of meaningful and work together with the departments to make sure that we're all working together. And we were sharing the same slides, but one of the things, so we have 99 schools in Seattle School District, and one thing I want to make sure that I highlight is we're a high-performing urban school district. We're doing well for a lot of the kids in our district, and we're making great strides, but one thing, looking at the data, we know that we aren't serving all kids, and we're not serving all kids well. We have an opportunity gap between 3rd through 8th grade early learning, ELA, English language adoption, is 50% lower for African American children than our white children, and that's pretty stark. And so when we as a school district look at how do we address some of these things, and we're looking at attendance, school climate, and other things at the district level, how are we going to be responsive to that? And our superintendent and Andrew have been really like, how are we going to make sure that we're serving our kids and serving all of our kids well? And knowing that 1 in 10 of our kids are Seattle Housing Authority children, that is a big number, and that's 5,500 kids that really need to be able to have those supports and have those systems in place between the principals, with the community partners we all work with, and make sure that we're all in alignment and leveraging each other's work. One of the things that I'm really cognizant about as my team, we manage all the MOUs and data sharing agreements also with all of I have 300 community partners that are registered in our system. And how do we as a team, with a team of, 3 people, manage all of those relationships? What do we put in place and make sure our partners know how to use the data that we develop and create to make sure we're getting to those student level interventions? But I will pass it on because I think we're going to have some more questions to be able to kind of get into more detail. Thank you.
Great. So I'm Kathleen Stiles. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at the U.S. Department of Education. And one of the things that's under me is student privacy, and we administer FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That involves, we run a complaint operation. We don't get that many complaints. We get 700 or 800 complaints a year from parents and students, and we resolve those complaints. But most importantly, and the largest focus of our work, is we provide technical assistance to schools, to school districts, third-party providers, sometimes to housing authorities, to people who have questions about what uses they can make of education data. We answer a lot of email questions, we put out guidance documents, we do site visits, we do webinars. We're trying to sort of help people get the answers that they need so that we can help education. So a show of hands, how many of you all here have tried to engage in data sharing with education data and you've run into problems? Okay. That's why I'm here. I'm sorry. So just by way of background, the environment across the country in terms of student privacy right now, I would have to characterize as still hot. It has been for about the last 3 years, maybe 4 years. And we have seen student privacy statutes pass in the majority of states. And the reason states are passing their own student privacy statutes is they think ours isn't adequate. And we have seen entire school boards voted out because of student privacy concerns about data sharing and technology in schools. Whether student privacy is a hot issue in your district and your state is very individual. Sometimes I make presentations and people have never heard of it. Is anybody here from New Jersey? I did a presentation in New Jersey once for the Council of School Attorneys there, and it had never entered their radar that student privacy was a concern, and yet you go and speak to places like Colorado, Denver, Colorado, Louisiana, other states that have New York, been very, very active in the student privacy scene, and it is a very hot political issue. Our statute, FERPA, is well over 40 years old. It is most certainly outdated. Whether it will be reauthorized is anyone's guess. One thing that is going on right now, if you have heard about the President's Regulatory Reform Task Force, we at the Department of Ed published a notice in the Federal Register asking for comments. If you think our FERPA regulations need to change, then you need to reply to that notice. It's in the Federal Register. If you just Google commenting on FERPA, you should find it, or you can get in touch with me. The kind of input that we receive during this process may be helpful in determining if we need to re-regulate if you assume that the statute itself will not be changed. On the tables here, I left a few, Ben, from my office, left a few copies of some black cards, and those cards are for PTAC, the Privacy Technical Assistance Center. If you run into issues with data sharing or school data or school privacy, reach out to us through the contact on those cards. And I also left some copies of some recent guidance that we put out. It may not answer the questions that you have, but it's recent and arguably applicable, so we brought a few copies of that as well. The super high level on FERPA for data sharing is that FERPA does not permit data to be redisclosed without prior written consent from the parents. So in a lot of the instances where you're doing data sharing, you're going to be getting consent. However, FERPA has, I think it's 17, maybe 18 different exceptions, and a variety of those exceptions do permit data sharing. The two most common ones that will come into play with the kind of data sharing that you all are going to want to engage in, actually three. The first is the school official exception, and schools and school districts can share data with essentially contractors. Using the school official exception. And there's a number of requirements to do that, but it's basic common sense sort of requirements. The other two exceptions deal with research, and those are the audit and evaluation exception and the studies exception. In spite of the name, you would think studies would be the more common one. It's not. It's really quite limited. But the audit and evaluation exception in many instances will allow schools to share data. The two most common situations that we run into when we get asked by the school or a third party, is it permissible to share data? The first is, and this is going to sound awful, but when you are trying to actually provide benefits to individual students rather than conduct research. There's not an exception for that unless it fits under the school official exception. And the second is when the research that you want to conduct is not research involving a federal education program. And the definition of federal education program is very, very broad, but it is not all-encompassing. And a lot of the evaluations, for example, of community-based partnerships are not going to be federal education programs. I want to speak briefly because I think the most valuable thing is interaction with you guys and question and answer. But sort of in terms of if you want to share data and either sharing or receiving on either end, the most important thing that you can do is to make the party, the school, want to share data with you. It's all about providing your value proposition. And I was hearing you talk about establishing the relationships and maintaining the relationships with your MOUs. That's what data sharing is about, because there is nothing under FERPA or any other education law that's going to make the school and the district share information with you. They're going to do it because they think it's best for their students to do so and that their data is safe. And personal relationships matter in that context. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and let my colleague from Atlanta speak, and then questions. Oops.
I didn't think I was going to come up this quickly because I texted my attorney when she started talking about FERPA. I just wanted to double check that everything was okay, but no, everything is fine. We've been doing this for a while.
Did I mention the handcuffs?
Good afternoon. Before beginning, I'd like to just acknowledge my colleagues from Atlanta because without the partnerships and the collaboration internally, but also our external partners, this work wouldn't be possible. So to begin, I'd just like to acknowledge Renee Bentley, who's our Senior Vice President of Partnerships and People Investments, which is a new division within AHA at this particular moment. Also, I'd like to introduce Jacqueline Anthony. And Jacqueline works with the Atlanta Public School System as the social worker coordinator, right? And then also Mr. Jeff Street in the back is with the United Way, and the United Way is our lead educational partner in our Choice Neighborhood work, okay? Just very quickly, to just give you some context, because after the last couple of days listening to everyone's presentations and views about data sharing and the work that you're doing, I thought to myself that, you guys are pretty much on it. So what else am I going to bring to the table? So I'm going to run through the slide presentation, but the discussion is going to be, one, the context of the data sharing agreement, also the data sharing agreement itself very briefly, and then also some next steps that AHA has in mind regarding long and short-term uses of the data, okay? A little bit about me. I spent 15 years as the executive director for the Atlanta Board of Education prior to coming to AHA. And I've also spent 20 years on higher education teaching at Atlanta Metropolitan and State College and Clark Atlanta University. I say that only to say that I've been exposed to and have been able to track our children from pretty much kindergarten all the way to college and many of the issues that they deal with, hence why this work is even more fulfilling and important. So just some organizational context. We're in the process of implementing a new strategy called Vision 2022 at the Atlanta Housing Authority. And just very quickly, the main focus is to create building blocks for stronger communities. And we recognize that in order to do that, we must address issues that are in the family. So we can't be just rooftops, but we also have to be people oriented. And we realize that education is a key component of that. So I'll also say that having the buy-in from your commissioners and from your your presidents, the CEO and executive directors in this work is also very important. And it doesn't help to have a good relationship with your CFO or the person that handles those MTW funds. As we move forward in our development in AHA, again, we're focusing in on creating communities where quality education is important, amenities. Is that me? Okay. Public infrastructures and environmental stability. So as we develop or as we partner with new developers, we will be conscientiously taking these things into consideration as we move forward. Now, we also understand that there are certain education gaps that exist related to student achievement and student progress. Some of them are broken down according to socioeconomic issues, well, all of them actually, and then also racial issues. And where an individual lives and access to stable housing has a direct correlation with student achievement, which we found through the research that we did with our data sharing agreement. So, we entered into our first data sharing agreement with APS in 2009. And I actually remember Renee, Sean Atkins calling me up at the board office wanting to get this agreement signed. And I'll be honest with you, I brushed him off quite a few times. And the reason why, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but we were just going through a cheating scandal. So the only thing that I wanted to do at the particular moment and APS wanted to do was close our shutters and put our head under our covers and not really deal with external issues because we were dealing with some internal issues. So the first agreement was in 2009. And of course, we're looking at 5 to 19-year-old students that participate in an AHA program. So that's either PBRA or the Housing Choice Voucher Program or our family communities. And those are what we're looking at. Now, we also wanted to ensure that we knew where these children were. So that was the purpose of the agreement. AHA wanted to better understand their performance, and APS wanted to understand who they were, where they lived, where did they go to school. Also, we wanted to look at what were their educational outcomes of the children assisted in our programs. Do those outcomes differ from children of the same socioeconomic background but are not on an AHA program? And then also, what were those actual educational outcomes? Our data sharing agreement revealed a couple of things. One, out of 54,000 kids in APS, about 9,000 of them, 9,800 of them are on an AHA program. So it's roughly 18%. Now that number is actually, in my opinion, higher than that because when you look at the actual data sharing match, we don't have a 100% match. All right? It's very hard to get a 100% match, but we looked at over 90 schools. And some of the information that APS was asked to share with AHA is related to the school that the child attends, the grade of the student, student grade progression, whether or not they were promoted, the attendance, end of grade tests, grade point averages, how they perform on early intervention programs and remedial education, milestones. So it's pretty broad. And what we're giving APS, we're giving them the names of the heads of households of our children, their ages, their birth dates, last 4 digits of the Social Security number. And we found that we had to increase the variables that we were giving to APS because it was very hard to match with only the last 4 digits of the Social Security. Okay, very good. Okay. So I'm going to go into just a little bit more on the findings because I think that that's really important. And when I looked at the graph that Seattle showed, I was rather surprised because ours is somewhat opposite. We found that the grade point average of AHA-assisted students in high schools, 9 through 12, was about a 75. And you know, that's not great, but for the sake of our argument, it was better than APS. The average absence from school, and this is across all grade levels, for the 16-17 school year was less than 4 days. Less than 4 days. Now in Georgia, using the CCRPI, which is the state's measurement for school system success, so the state measures the school system on CCRPI, the school system measures the school on CCRPI, and the highest you can get is 100. It's based on progression, achievement, and attendance is a variable also. Well, the measurement on CCRPI is 6 days or more. So we were very pleased to see that our students were actually, you know, at that 4-day piece. Because when you look at, if you do 6 days for 2 years, now you're at about 68% attendance in terms of kids not coming to school, which 2 years will get you on a list that says that you're a low-performing school. So when we talk about the value proposition of the data sharing agreement as it relates to APS, what we're bringing to the table is that we want to help you tackle some issues that will take the spotlight off of your performance in the state. A total of 90 schools, and then better scores on end-of-score tests. Now, I'll go ahead and I'll just jump to some of the things that we're looking at. I think, Abra, the presentation will be available for the group? Okay. So in the future, what we plan on doing, using this data that we've received, is looking at a couple of things. One, we're instituting an attendance program, because what we found is when we look at CCRPI and we look at the schools that are within our choice neighborhood, because that's a nice little box that we can operate in the choice neighborhoods. It's an elementary, a middle, a K-8, and a high school. So we're going to focus in on assisting those schools in increasing their attendance, because their CCRPI number for attendance, meaning 10 being the highest, the high school was 3.9. Right? The middle school was, which is Brown Middle School, that was a 5.4, and M. Agnes Jones, which is a STEM school, actually had about a 6.9. Okay, so our goal is to increase those CCRPI numbers. It's simple, meaning it's measurable, and we're going to do this through incentives. We're going to create an incentive program for the students, for the schools, to reward them for actually moving that CCRPI number needle. Additionally, the Atlanta Public Schools has a ton of surplus properties, you know, through the years, just closing schools, merging schools, et cetera. So one of the things that we've been working with APS on is, one, developing a student generation model, which means based on this many units that you build, this is how many potential students can actually be coming into this particular school cluster or school zone. So we've been working with them on that. Additionally, again, quid pro quo value proposition is that with those surplus properties, we can offer to get APS out of the business of being a developer or out of the real estate business by, you know, and again, this is where relationships come in, getting the right of first refusal for surplus properties in exchange for direct funding for many of their turnaround strategies, which are broken down into areas such as early learning, reading, and social and emotional learning. So those are some of the uses. And then Renee is also looking at some of this data as it relates to how can we provide some interventions around behavior, attendance, et cetera, after school care. So in sum, what we've realized at AHA is that we've got to deal with the child. If we're going to break this cycle of poverty, of dependence on a voucher, while we will be the quarterback to facilitate the wraparound and support services for our parents and families, we also want to take a direct role in impacting a positive trajectory for our children. So with that, thank you very much.
Well, many thanks to all our panelists. I think that was a great overview of the territory we're in. Just as a clarifying question for me to start, and I'll put out a few discussion questions and then open it up to the floor, but I wanted to clarify that, Howard, you were talking about a data sharing agreement that allows you to match children with APS, but the data comes back to you in aggregate form, right? Not in at the individual level. Is that true for Seattle as well, or is it an individual level sharing?
That's true.
Okay.
It's true for Seattle.
So how does that affect consenting? And Kathleen, maybe you could talk about that too. I mean, what would be, are there housing authorities that are consenting on the individual level? I've seen it in Promise Neighborhoods through data intermediaries. But what are the consenting parameters and how are those handled in arrangements where the data comes back in aggregate form?
So I want to make sure I understand the situation first. So the housing authority is sending individual data to the school district who's providing aggregate back?
Yes, so where is the consenting happening?
That's not, you're not sending out your individual level PII
So
student information. There's
in the
not-
schools then, there is no
not
consenting.
a FERPA issue there.
But is there consenting on the housing authority end that needs to go on?
So the way that we go about we do the data match a couple times a year. And what happens for the individual program level, if we're actually, the housing authority is partnering with us to do an intervention, those kids that are enrolled in those programs have to fill an individual consent FERPA form for the data to be shared. But that stays there, but that's how we get around that. But in our analysis, everything is on the proxy de-identifiable stage. It's one individual intervention where we have to figure out how to do the data, and that's where things get complicated.
So you do consenting with kids through the FERPA process. Now, explaining him why that would be if you're sending the data back to Andrew in aggregate form?
So that's how we just do the analysis of the programs on the high level. But if we're looking at an individual program, like our Race to the Top Deep Dive 3, we have in our Hope 6 program where we're operating in 5 different schools.
Yep.
We're making sure SHA is involved, but that intervention, we're dealing with it at the school level where we're doing the FERPA forms and the kids are submitting those things through our nonprofit partner. And then we're dealing with them. It's actually through the nonprofit partner. It's through the nonprofit partner that's getting the authority to be able to share the data. It's actually not SHA at that point.
Well, then that leads to my other question is, can you describe data intermediary? I know you talked about having a choice neighborhood arrangement, Howard, and I know the Seattle Housing Authority does all kinds of innovative programming. You're one of the stars. How do you see data intermediaries? Because that seems like a solution often, especially in this climate where there's so much collaboration and coordination that maybe it's not always the housing authority that is the entity that needs the consenting so much as an intermediary. But do any of you have some comments about that and how that might work?
With our choice neighborhood, and that's one of the reasons why we have the United Way as our educational partner. So once we got that data back, the strategy that the United Way and that education collaborative have put together uses that particular data to determine where students are in the city of Atlanta that are, for example, former residents of our university homes. So it tends to get somewhat complicated because the students are so spread out. So we may have 1 or 2 at every school. So that's why we have another tier where we actually focus in on the actual neighborhood. But through our partners, we get to analyze that data, from that standpoint.
We do have some programs in which we actually do require and do solicit consent forms and get the consent of the family to share the information. But it's a program by program. It's not for the entire MOU. But for a particular school where there's some interventions going on that we want to test or that we are involved in working with individual students, we do, in those cases, go through the process of offering and getting or not families to say, yes, we consent to this, and actually have them go through sign the paperwork.
And if I might add, that in APS, in their student handbook, there's a sign-up sheet where parents are consenting for information to be shared. And we're very specific in our data sharing agreement, to be consistent with FERPA. It's right here, this bottom line, that says, that basically says, that the information will be used for research purposes according to FERPA guidelines. So in the beginning of the year, the parents actually sign their consent form for sharing of information.
Well, we're talking about intermediaries here. The guidance that I left copies of on the table may be relevant if you all are using intermediaries. And it is specifically about entities that are using integrated data systems. And that's the term we use when you've got one system for the city that holds the child welfare data, the housing data, the school data, et cetera. And if that is something that you all are doing, then I definitely want to refer that for you to that guidance that's on the table. And it's essentially a two-step analysis. And the first step of the analysis is the school district deciding that it's going to use the integrated data system partner as sort of its warehouse. And you do that under the school official exception. You have a contract with them. You say, we're giving you our data so that, when it comes time for us to make decisions about data sharing, you're going to provide the data governance, the data management, the data security, and help us with that process. And then when you get individual requests for, I want to use the data to do X or Y or Z, then you analyze those individual requests using whatever is the applicable exception. And it is a way that does allow you to use data without consent. And while consent is sometimes what you're going to need to do under FERPA or some other statute, we're not the only statute out there with some of the data that y'all are talking about. Some of the issues of consent, I probably don't need to tell you all, is that sometimes it can have an exclusionary effect, particularly if you have non-involved parents and you need consent from parents. And if you're doing research, sometimes it can skew your study because you don't get consent from everyone you need it from. So anyway, if you are using an intermediary, check the guidance on the table.
My last question before I open it up to the floor comes out of some two-generation work that I do with whole families, working with the Ascend program at Aspen Institute. And, I've come to think about services integration and data sharing on two vectors, where there's a horizontal vector, which is standard service integration across program silos, be it an educational domain, a housing domain. But in two-generation, there's this vertical vector of child and adults in the same household. And I would think that that vector comes up a lot in partnerships between housing authorities and educational institutions, because housing authorities, of course, by the nature of the service they offer, cater to entire families. The service is a whole family service. And I know that there's service integration that goes on in schools across the single child vector, the child level. But are you all aware, and this might be something Kathleen knows about, or you all have seen in your venues, of data sharing that's going on either for the purpose of research or intervention that combines the vectors, where there's data that's being shared on the whole family and parents as well as on the child's educational status in order to have a sort of a more holistic analysis of family outcomes? Is that going on anywhere, or is it in your work already?
I love that question because it just shows a holistic and the approach to, I think, what is important to all of us in this room. So not specifically the data, but what the data, the interpretation of the data could mean. Meaning, if a child is chronically absent, and the data reveals that. If a child is chronically doing poorly on end of score tests or has a high mobility rate, jumping from school to school, all of those things tell a story. And what our goal is specifically at AHA, we have a Human Development Services division that Renee is also over as well, that our goal is to try to help our families move from mere compliance, but to competence as well. So when you see certain trends in the child data, it's pretty safe to assume or hypothesize that there's some other issues going on in the home. And what we would like to do is position ourselves to be able to address those issues. And APS has also bought into that approach because, again, the school system's job is to educate. But if the partners can, and if AHA can be a quarterback, but if the partners can actually fulfill their missions, their social mission, in terms of providing wraparound and support services to our families, strong communities, strong kids, strong schools. So I hope that gave some context.
Yeah, that gets exactly at some of what I was asking about. Does anyone else have any comments on this, Andrew?
Well, I was going to wait for Kathleen to answer it first, and then tailor my answer to what she said.
You can get it.
There are specific programs that we will ask for consent for a number of different things, and it's a program by program kind of look. We don't do that for the general MOU. But as Howard says, yeah, you get back information and it suggests lots of different things. But there are some specific programs, and mostly it would be around evaluation, where we will need to extract information to dig a little bit deeper into an analysis, that we will ask for consent to look at the family as opposed to a particular data element.
So maybe just a little comment. I am certain we have run across this in some of the help desk tickets that we have dealt with in the Privacy Technical Assistance Center in PTAC, but I don't recall any of the specifics on this right now. It just sort of illustrates really the complexity of data sharing, because every data set that you're trying to link to and bring into your world has got, in all likelihood, different privacy protections. And really the challenge for those of us in federal agencies is to try to create bridges between the different statutes. What is FERPA? How does that relate to HIPAA? How does that relate to COPPA? I mean, and that doesn't even take into account the various state statutes that you all have. We've put out some guidance on this area, and I think it's something that there's more to do. There is almost, I think, infinite complexity in the kind of data sharing agreements that you all contact us and ask questions about, and good luck.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to the floor to see if any folks have follow-up questions of their own.
Hi, I've got two questions for Kathleen. And first of all, I want to acknowledge that I think things have come a long way. And I know this because about 8 or 9 years ago, I proposed to do a data sharing agreement with my first school district. And I asked my liaison at HUD what she thought. And her response is she thought I was going to go to jail. So there's definitely been progress since then.
Yeah. Okay.
At least I'm not in jail.
You still might go.
Worked out.
Yeah. So in terms, though, of a partnership between your office and PD&R to look at a sort of on a national level, how I'm sorry. Okay, sorry. Policy Development and Research, the arm that does data work at HUD, who are very interested in these kind of evaluative efforts because a lot of the work that is being done, at least in our world at HUD, is looking at educational outcomes, and they'd like to keep us out of jail. So first question really is, do you have a working relationship with HUD talking about how from federal level you can facilitate these kind of data sharing bridges that can then sort of flow down to the kind of partnerships we're trying to create in the field? And second question is, having ingested way too much Cass Sunstein when he was in the White House, what is the position on opting out as opposed to opting in on the consent forms?
So yes, absolutely. We work with HUD. I think that I am here today because actually a staff member of mine was supposed to speak today, and he had another engagement, and I told him I'd show up for him. And he is our representative to the task force that works with HUD on data matters. I actually don't know the details of what work is in progress right now. I know that in the past we have provided comment and feedback on a toolkit that I believe HUD put out sometime last year that dealt with data sharing. And it's very much something that we like to do, is to work with other agencies, and HUD is one that, is a prime candidate for that. And Cass Sunstein, I feel you. And whether you're opting out or opting in, really depends on which statute you're talking about. And, under FERPA, the consent, the standard is prior written consent from the parent, and it's not really an opt-out, opt-in situation with regard to the data sharing. The only way that opt-out, opt-in comes into play in the FERPA scenario is with directory information, which if you are doing research, I would not advise you to try to use the directory information exception. Sometimes it comes into play, but it's not usually going to be appropriate.
Just to clarify that, I want to be clear, we're not doing this.
Okay.
We handed a lease renewal.
The real questions are hard enough. Don't ask hypotheticals.
Somebody else is doing it, but they don't.
You got a friend.
Yes. So if there was a lease renewal or an annual recertification that essentially had a box that said, check this if you don't want the data shared, would that be an appropriate approach?
The standard under FERPA is that you have to affirmatively consent, and it needs to be before the data sharing, and it needs to be in writing. We don't put a whole lot more requirements on it beyond that. We could look at your lease if you want.
Well, we're not doing it.
Okay. But if you had a friend, yeah.
In Tacoma.
Renee are you looking at somebody else?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. So I'm Renee Bentley, Atlanta, Georgia. I have a couple of comments and then a question. So we're at the very front end, as Dr. Grant has said, in doing strategic planning around partnerships and people investments and our human development strategy. So, but a couple of thoughts. We are doing the data sharing agreement and working that through, but we also do plan to implement authorizations for release of any residents who participate, whose children participate in our various sponsored programs. So they will be doing that individually so that we can get the data that we need in order to make a difference in those children's lives and to know that we're making that difference. So we need the baselining, and we also need to know, the impact that we're making. And then secondly, we are looking at culture change. I think the gentleman over there mentioned it, and how we do business as a housing authority. So we're touching families with housing. We can leverage the staff that we have. When you talk about managing the program and having a few staff, where there are lots of other staff that are there that are talking to residents all the time. We're looking at how we can revise the authorization form, authorization for release of information on the front end, how we can have a different conversation with residents on the front end about education, the importance of it, and other things. So I think changing our culture is important. So question I have, what software are you using to manage resident data tracking and impact and partnership data?
So we don't, if you're asking us.
So I'm asking more the the partnership, you manage partnerships, you mentioned that you have.
Yeah, partnerships, not in the same sense that you
Well,
have.
not you necessarily, Kathleen. The second, this guy here. No, I can't see your name, I'm sorry. But what software are you using to manage partnerships? And then for those of you who are delivering resident programs, programs for youth, what software are you using to manage resident participation data and tracking all of these different metrics to see what impact you're making? Does that make sense?
Yes, so Andrew will talk about the housing authority, but for schools, it is absolutely a culture shift. When I came on, all of the contracts and documents were basically in steel cabinets or steel. So we're really working on shifting that to like, how do we use data and beyond just a PDF on a folder? So we're actually in the beginning stages of creating a partnership portal similar to what Oakland Unified has. And that we'll be able to see who has an MOU, who will have with the district, who they're partnering with, who their funding sources are, and just a whole suite of different elements we can know and be able to share with the principals. Here's the website. These are all the people in your region. These are people that are doing the work, and we have 9 different whole child elements to categorize the relationships. And so principals will be able to have I won't say a one-stop shop, because we don't want to make it any kind of an evaluative tool, but more of these are people in your neighborhood. Give us a call if you have questions. But right now, our relationships right now are tracked on Excel. Our research and evaluation team, they're way more complex, using different database tools that we don't actually use on my team, because we do more of the analysis. We don't do the data pulls and stuff that folks would have to do.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
We just use our public housing system, which is Yardi, for our public housing residents and emphasis for our Section 8 housing choice voucher residents. And then we have our staff are very creative in pulling data from there, and then they sometimes build their own systems to track the information and create the analysis. But the basic information is in our fundamental system that we manage our housing with.
Okay. We found Yardi wasn't really made for that, and so we tried to customize it and invested a lot in that. It didn't work very well. And so now we're using efforts to outcomes, and really that's still complicated and not working as effectively. We need something more streamlined. So anyone who's aware of anything, I'm very interested in finding out about that.
Folks are often happy with Salesforce too. Okay. Yeah. And I've seen some modules for this kind of work, so.
Eileen Fitzgerald with SAFE. I was actually going to say we have some folks who are moving from ETO to Salesforce. So whether 5 years later in Salesforce they'll be happy, I think is still unknown. But my question, it may be way too basic here, but if we have a housing organization, not a housing authority, right, who wants to work with an administrative entity to see how their kids are doing, but is not asking back for identified data, but rather aggregated data, does FERPA cover the housing organization's request for their residents to release, to allow the housing organization to see back that aggregated data? We've had like lots of different debates with our organization's lawyers who seem to think that if I want to give a rent roll list to an administrative, the whatever administrative entity is representing the public schools, and I just want back, if there are 5 kids in this school, some number at which it's not possible to identify at a lower level, and they're performing this way. Is it the school in that situation that's covered by FERPA, or is it actually the housing organization covered by FERPA because they're getting something back, but they aren't actually touching the data in any way? They're just giving a rent roll of the list. Does that make sense?
I think so. So I actually do not know what statute, if any, covers the confidentiality of data that's given to the housing authority by the residents. Does one of you all want to help me here? Is there a statute? The Federal Privacy Act?
Yes.
Why? It's not a federal entity collecting it.
On behalf of the, right.
So it's Privacy Act protected. Okay. So, okay. We're actually having a lot of conversations across government now about what the federal government's obligations are with regard to making grantees do various things in the privacy space. So anyway, that's a useful comment, and I know the CPO at HUD, so maybe I will. And I'm trying to think through my Privacy Act because, you know, I know that, but it's not my primary statute. You know, I know that the Privacy Act allows data sharing in identifiable form for research purposes. So if you're talking about research, I presume that's going to be permissible under the Privacy Act for that. I hesitate to offer too specific an answer, though, because, you know, this is a situation where the details actually matter, and, you know, happy to follow up and think about that some more later. I'm sorry, I don't have a more specific answer for you.
By FERPA, right?
Oh, no. FERPA covers schools.
So what I've done with some of our partnership groups, and well, it was a friend. I'm sorry, it wasn't me. But when we deal with some of those stuff where we have a community partner that may be working with SHA on a project, is when we develop the FERPA form, because we actually, to make it easy, we do the FERPA forms and then give them to the partner, and then the partner goes out and gets the signatures and the consent from the parents, and then it'll cover both SHA and the partner organization to be able to share back and forth. I'm not sure it's the same kind of issue, but on a program level, that's kind of how we work that, to make sure that we don't have to do 2 FERPA forms for both organizations for one program, which has complicated us, and we had to go and send community organizations back out to go get the forms re-signed again by the third-party agency.
So that helpful piece of advice will be the last word, and thank you for this. Well, okay, well, we are past our time, but so, Okay, one more and then we'll cut it. Okay.
Hi, I'm Trace Well from Fresno. I had a question about for both housing authorities, the individual waivers. And Andrew, you had mentioned earlier about you use the individual waivers for some programs. And we have a data sharing agreement that we're working on getting aggregate data and doing all that good stuff, but we've also then started into the world of the individual waivers. So our first one was around absenteeism. We took one of our largest properties. We went out and got waivers from as many parents as we could, because we wanted them to allow us to access the absentee data so that our property management staff could actually support parents in making sure their kids showed up to school, right? I mean, what probably we all care about. So we've had two kind of issues. One is, have you guys had any great success in finding ways to get parents to sign it, besides the Stevens friend where you do it at the recertification time? But I mean, we've had a fair, we've had bounce houses, we've had barbecues, and talk through, and we're probably at maybe only 12 or 13%. And some of it is, people are worried about, and some of it's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. If you're not going to make me do this and keep my housing, then, I'm not going to sign it. Have you guys had any success in getting large percentages of parents to agree to the waiver? And then also the second question would be, do you have some programs that you've actually gotten the waivers, the individual waivers on, and had success in making some sort of an impact, whether it be around absenteeism or, I don't know, pick one, grade level reading, whatever it is?
So we've been generally successful, but it's been very staff intensive, in which we've had a staff person who works in the kind of area of parent engagement, have already built relationships, because we're usually in that community for some reason or another. And so there's some contacts that have already been made, some relationships that have already been built. And so when we start a program there, then there's a familiar face that can explain that there's some trust that's been built up, that they can explain what this is about, why it's important, why we want you to do it, et cetera. And that's been very, very successful in that regard. Because that one-to-one contact is so important, and folks are much more trusting and willing to go through with things at that point. And yes, it's been successful. We've, and in our Choice Neighborhood program, we've got an elementary school where we've invested a number of education resources there for increasing the academic achievement of the students that are there, and being able to track individually the cohorts has been one of the principal efforts around monitoring and evaluating the progress of the initiatives that have been in that school. And yes, so that did have to have the individual sign off, the individual waiver by the parents to be able to use that information for the research purposes for that particular program. And we've been able to track it. It's been useful for us to be able to identify that data, and we are using it to not only monitor the progress, but tweak the programs to emphasize what other initiatives that we need to bring to bear.
So, as in all things, trust is paramount, so those relationships make the difference in that kind of outreach. So anyway, I want to thank our panelists. This was fabulous information. I hope you all got a lot out of
it. Okay, so I have good news and better news as our panelists exit. The good news is that you have an opportunity to have a little reflection time now at your tables. I'm going to give you a couple of questions to discuss. The even better news is that following our reflection and discussion, there will be a reception here in this building. Where is Abra? I'm looking. I think that is true. I think it's true, and I think it's going to be right out there. So know that your reward for a long day of good, hard listening and discussing is soon to come. So here are two questions for you to take on for about 10 minutes at your tables. One is, what from those of you who were here yesterday, but in any case, all of you who are here today, what, if anything, have you heard that has triggered in you the thought and the commitment, I am going to act on this? What, if anything, are you going to act on based on what you've heard today? Second, what help can this community of practice be to you, whether it is specific to that action or more general? What do you think this community of practice can do that would be especially helpful?